I think that this is an important module because, as I was trying to say before, a lot of things that we see are not, hey, let's derive new criteria. It's, hey, let's develop site-specific criteria because for some reason we're having trouble meeting the criteria that we have. And so this is the one that we see most often where people try to make some adjustments. And our job is to see if it's technically sound. What do I do with the click-click? You've seen the disclaimer. Okay. So site-specific criteria is really a tool to tailor the standards that we came up, or your state came up, and to make them more accurately express the uses and the water quality types that you guys have in your region, in your state, and and so the criteria that we developed is sort of for the nation, and California is not the nation, Orange County is not the nation, so those are the types of reasons we do these things. And so the whole point of the site-specific criteria is to adjust the criteria to something that is still protective of the use, right? It's still a number. All right, and this last part is really about if you develop a site-specific number, it still requires EPA approval before it becomes applicable for Clean Water Act standards. There is one little slight exception for California. So when might you want to use a site-specific criteria? Well, one is when you can't meet the criteria and you think there's something going on in your waters. But really, it's when you have the data available to make, a site-specific criteria. So here's like 3 things. Like, for some reason, you think that the critters in your waters have different sensitivities than the critters that we use in our national database. Or for some reason, you think that the waters that you have are really silty, have a lot of organic matter, something that will make it a little bit less, will affect the final concentration. Or when there's just really natural high concentration of something like arsenic, right, that comes from a hot spa or something like that, right? As try as you might never going to get it down. So if you can show that the critters that are adapted to that place are still happy at that high concentration of arsenic or whatever, then we can develop a site-specific criteria for that. So I've listed those 3, and so here's the answer for those 3. So if you think that your critters are less sensitive than the ones that we've used in the national criteria, then you use this thing called the resident species recalculation. Good name, huh? So basically what you're doing is if you have data from California, from Hawaii, that sort of matches the data that we use, you can replace it, rerun the calculation, and see if you get a different number that you like. The second one was touched on by Deborah. So things like the water effect ratio and the biotic ligand model are accepted practices for metals, and they deal with ways to adjust the metals criteria. So in the WER, a lot of these lab tests that we used in our criteria development were done in laboratories, right? And most streams are not laboratories. So in essence, what you're doing is you're comparing the LC50 that you get in your waters to the LC50 in lab water. And if one is higher than the other, say 2 versus 1, you can get a water effect ratio of 2. Does that make sense? Okay. So in California, under the California Toxics Rule, the water effect ratio is pre-approved. Okay? Now this thing called the biotic ligand, Stacy has a question. Speak into the mic, Stacy.
So if the water effect ratio is pre-approved, then plugging in the data to the particular site-specific information, that would not require another promulgation of a site-specific objective?
No, because it's already in there. Now, just because it's pre-approved doesn't mean that you shouldn't share it with us, because sometimes we have information that you guys don't. And so it's always nice for regions or states that are looking at sort of chat with us about it. But they're basically proved in so long as you follow the procedures that are outlined in how you do this. The biotic ligand model is another approach. And basically what that says is there are things in water that we know of that affect, and we can model those. So it's things like dissolved organic carbon. It's things like cations and anions. It's those types of things that we know. And so the water effect ratio is really just empirical. I'm going to test this to that. The biotic ligand model is basically a model. I will say that EPA likes the biotic ligand model. We promulgated the biotic ligand model for as a 304A recommended criteria for copper. So that's that. I will also say that there has been some mischief with water effect ratios. And so if it's greater than 5, we're going to have sort of a jaundiced look at it, okay? And so what we encourage folks who are doing water effect ratios is to, while you're out there, collect the data to run the biotic ligand model, and we'll compare those two. Does that make sense? All right. And then finally, the last one is the reference water approach. And that's basically what we talked about before, where maybe you have a hot spring, it has high arsenic, and if you can show that this arsenic is not affecting the critters that live there and adopted to that high arsenic, then we can develop a site-specific criteria for that.
Oh, just a clarification on the site, the water chemistry approaches, the water effect ratio and the biotic ligand. I'm trying to speak to the other, it goes. So for those two, for the site water chemistry approaches, would you be adopting the numbers or the approaches?
So the WQS in California is pre-approved, right?
Okay.
The biotic ligand model is you would run the model, develop your site-specific criteria, and then send it into EPA. We would look through your model and then act on it, either approve or disapprove if for some reason. Kevin has a question.
Yeah, I guess just to flesh that out for a minute. So do we need to take that to a regional board approval, state board approval, OAL, then to EPA? Or are you saying there's a shortcut if we're going to use the biotic ligand model?
No, I'm sorry. If you use the biotic ligand model, it is a site-specific standard. It needs to go through the entire process. Only the WQS is pre-baked. And I don't think the pre-bake is in the Hawaiian numbers, so you guys have to use the biotic ligand model. Okay, where am I now? So as Deborah discussed, we've published a lot of new criteria that are using sort of this modeled approach, right? So we know that several metals are a function of hardness, and so they have this equation that sort of ameliorates the effect of the toxicant. The biotic ligand model I just sort of talked about. For fresh water, it's based on 10 parameters. And the aluminum, it's the same type of thing. There's things like DOC and what else is up there? pH and hardness that affect aluminum toxicity. But rather than having a fancy model, it's just a multilinear regression, right? Y equals mx plus b, right, plus another thing. So that's all it is. And then this final thing says, you could adopt these as site-specific criteria, right? So, why would you have these site-dependent criteria that are a function of hardness? Well, it's because, there's metals out there. They're out there naturally. And so, we don't really care about the metal. We care about the metal that's toxic. And hardness can ameliorate or affect the hardness. And, other stuff can affect toxicity too. So I'm going to show you the equation for the hardness adjustment that's been in our standards for thousands of years, I think. And it looks like a fancy equation, but basically, whoops, how did she do that pointer thing? I like that. Basically, this is just, a linear equation in log space. And at the end of here is just a number to convert it from total to dissolved. So when you look at our packages, our criteria, you'll see a number, and a footnote says that number is based on a hardness of 100. And so what you have to do if you want to use it for 150, you just do the math. And what I did is I just have a spreadsheet. So whenever I have a new number, I just type it in and bing, that's the number. And I think I got ahead of myself because, so like I said, the numbers in the table for all these metal is basically 100. But it's adjusted by these things. And so you guys remember your basic math, y equals mx plus b. That's m, that's b. These are for the acute, and these are for the chronic. And these are the parameters that go in that equation that I just showed you. The parameters are slightly different, like copper is a different parameter than lead. So that's why they have those things. 15 minutes, easy peasy. Do I have to talk more about the water effect ratio? You think you guys got that? Anyone really confused about water effect ratio? Okay. I'm trying to save time to increase break. This is just sort of, showing how hardness is a good thing to adjust for, but there's other things like pH that can affect hardness. So this is sort of leading up to why we have the biotic ligand model. And those things vary all over the place, right? So it's not like hardness and pH and DOC all. And these things affect the bioavailability of copper. And this is just to say what I said earlier, that EPA has a 304A criteria for copper, the copper BLM. That's what we think is the bee's knees. We think everyone should use it. It reflects the greatest science, and it's a model. And it's based on, your time series of pH, DOC, and hardness. And it has all of these nice little cations and anions. And I'll just give you a hint. If you don't have those, you're missing one or two, EPA published a book, a document that has what the expected hardness or DOC or these anions are by region. So you can just go, I live in this region of the United States. These are the expected calcium numbers. You can plug those in. By address, no, yeah. And these are really cheap to measure. So this is what the biotic ligand model really is. We have a fish. We have a metal, that's the Me2+. We have particulate organic carbon and dissolved organic carbon. And we have a bunch of these anions and cations. And we have pH up at the top. And all those things are sort of affecting the availability of metal. So we call things that attach to metals ligands. And when they attach to metals, it decreases the toxicity. And so all of this is based on, what's the likelihood that this copper, in this case, molecule is going to attach to the gill of this little fish and hurt it. Again, this is what I said before. I probably should have paced this better, but it basically said we used to love water effect ratios. We thought they were great. And then we realized that there are some issues with the water effect ratios, and that's why we support the biotic ligand model as a better way to predict toxicity than the simple hardness-based and the water effect ratio.
So Terry, I mean, just from like a big picture,
Yeah.
like understanding, so if for California, being a little California-centric,
Yeah, go ahead.
that we already have numbers in the books at all regions for all these parameters,
You do.
right?
Yep.
So it's, how different is really this bioligand model versus the water effects ratio? You know, like if it's substantially different, has EPA or someone else calculated that difference to say, wow, look at how different these numbers are?
Yeah,
You're really missing out if you're not adopting
There
this
are a
approach.
lot of papers that sort of discuss that, both for the freshwater and for the marine waters. We also have a marine water biotic ligand model that's in press, I guess. It could be really big. So we've seen water effect ratios, on the order of 10, and we've seen, when we do the side by side, the BLM is on the order of 2 to 4. So it's a big, big difference. So only if you use the biotic ligand model will you see this model input. It's not that complicated. It's basically I've got some samples, I got some dates, I got some POC, DOC, and then the output is this. You get your chronic and acute values. And then, I really don't know if you take a geometric mean of these or what. I haven't even thought that much, but there's a document that discusses this, and it's useful if you're interested in this. As I said before, it requires 10 input parameters, but we have this, this document here that developed these regional estimates, and so if for some reason you're missing sulfate, you can approximate it here. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm just going to use that. Yeah, so this document that I talk about provides the 10th percentile estimates. And basically what it says here, yeah, you can get the DOC number here, but that is such a crucial parameter that we recommend that you guys get that number. Yeah, go ahead.
Are there other values that you recommend getting besides DOC and I suppose calcium and magnesium?
The recommendation is you get them all, but the bang for the buck is DOC and pH, and hardness, I guess. Those three basically are the drivers. And this just shows an example of those 10th percentile estimates that you can just pull out of this book. So if you're in ecoregion 1, you can pick up a conductivity of 58. But it's cheap, and I bet you guys live in places where the conductivity is a lot higher than 58. Yeah, so it's probably better to not use the book. And again, monitoring for these things is really cheap. So what this says is you run these models, and you just pick the lowest one, and that's your number. So really hard to conceive, but that's basically what we do.
Hey, Terry.
Yeah.
So is there any guidance out of EPA on when we should be collecting samples to feed the model as far as seasonality or number of samples over a period of time?
I haven't thought about that. Clearly, if you're doing it in wet weather, the numbers will be all over the map because big storms, small storms, early storms, late in the storm, early in the storm. All those things will affect it. So I think that the concept is that during these dry weather, these things will be pretty stable. And the swamp monitoring program monitors all those things, so something to think about. Oh, question, yeah, go ahead.
So the copper CTR wasn't based on the BLM?
No, no, the copper CTR is just a hardness-based adjusted number.
Uh-huh,
So the CTR was done in 2000, right?
uh-huh.
And that's kind of set in stone until state board decides to change it or adopt site-specific stuff. And the science has basically progressed over the last 20 years. So that's why the biotic ligand model is interesting. I have 5 minutes. I can do this. So this performance-based criteria is probably the least fleshed out. It's more of a concept that if you have natural high chemical X and you go through a rigorous scientific process with predictable, repeatable outcomes that is clear and transparent, we can approve it. And the basis for that is this memo from Tudor Davies in 1997, so it's been around for a while. And it describes what the definition of natural background is. It says we have a provision that's you can set the number equal to that. And there's a couple of documents here that provide more than I'm going to tell you in my 5 minutes. But this is the concept. Copper criteria is not achieved. It's because of natural background levels of copper. And the fundamental question is, like this pointer, does it support the aquatic life use? And then I love this one. It could be difficult. So, I have 5 minutes to conclude. I think I'll take the entire 5 just to be persnickety. Site-specific criteria can be more stringent than the national recommended criteria. It could be less stringent, right? It does not change the use, right? So if you want to change the designated use, this is not the way to do it. You do a UAA, which we talked about yesterday. They are water quality standards, with the exception of the water effect ratio for California. All of these must be submitted to EPA for approval, go through the process that the state has, get Attorney General certification, go through your public hearings using this 40 CFR Part 25.5. And that's important because a lot of people forget this 25.5, which says you need a 45-day public notice and the information needs to be available 30 days ahead, right? So in the past, a lot of people were just doing 30 days, great. 45 days. And basically support with data and analysis and protect that designated use. So we have 3 minutes for questions, or we can start our break early. Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of a practical question, is for the performance-based criteria, how do you enforce on intent, basically, is the problem that we run into is, so say that we're going to implement certain BMPs so that we're demonstrating that we are doing what we can, but how do you enforce on their ability to perform what their performance-based model would indicate? So, we're going to do this and we think it's going to have this effect. Without having a numeric criteria, how would you enforce on that? Because who's to say whether they're actually trying as hard as they said they were going to try to actually do something?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, I really don't know. But the intent of this is we want you to eliminate all human and anthropogenic sources of, these bad chemicals. And, nature is okay. But that's a lawyer and enforcement question. I don't know. Maybe that's why these are fairly rare. Yeah.
I was just curious if you had an opinion about what is more difficult, a UAA or a site-specific objective, or if EPA has a preference?
We prefer UA, no, I take that back. We prefer site-specific objectives. We want to protect the use, right? Maintain the use. We don't want to have degradation of the use, yeah. We even prefer variances to UAAs. We'll talk about that later.
Good answer, Terry.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on using site-specific criteria for temperature?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I know that you're from Region 10.
Yeah, in Oregon.
Yeah, Oregon,
Portland.
yeah. So there's a long and sordid tale about Oregon, and I don't have all of the details, so you guys can correct me, because I know it from the 50,000 foot. So Oregon had a temperature standard. I don't remember what it was, but they had a temperature standard. Oregon did a TMDL on temperature. And the TMDL on temperature said, in essence, instead of that number, use this number. I'm sort of painting a crass picture because I don't know the details. They got sued. The court said, if you want to change the standard, change the standard. You can't change the standard in a TMDL. Did I get that basically right? Okay. So what was your question?
Do you have thoughts about using site-specific criteria in a new standard for temperature?
I think it's perfectly acceptable. It's just, hard to do. I mean, we're facing this in California where we're using the Region 10 numbers, and people are arguing that it's not the right numbers to use for the Central Valley or for Southern California. The trouble is finding defensible, scientifically based numbers. Did you want to say something, Wanjali?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in any of these situations where you're finding that the states are figuring out what the right target is through the TMDL, and in reality, the right way to lock that in for that water body is going to be a site-specific criteria. I mean, I think that's what we've been trying to push. The issue ends up becoming that there's there's concerns around, people feel more comfortable having it in a TMDL, I'm not really sure why, than locking it into a site-specific criteria, but in reality, that's the right thing to do. Right.
Okay, there was one final question. It was yours, right? You wanted a question? Yeah, go ahead.
It was just a comment, but I don't have a...
Yeah, and this will be the last one because break is in the way. Okay, well, the second, the last one.
Yeah, sure. I just wondered how you would link a site-specific objective to a beneficial use. And second part of that question, can you do it retroactively?
Well, I don't know about the retroactive, right? Because...
So if you had a site-specific objective that's not linked to a beneficial use, how would you deal with that?
So I think I know where this question is stemming from. So let me lay it out in sort of broad strokes, just like I did the previous one. So the state board just adopted the bacteria criteria for the state, and they have the uniform bacteria criteria for the entire state.
E. coli for freshwater.
I'm sorry, yeah, E. coli for freshwater, yeah. But Regional Board 6 up in Tahoe, very nice, not a whole lot of people, not a whole lot of pollution, had very low numbers that were based on background. So there was this kerfuffle about would the state board standards supplant these protective standards that Regional Board 6 had. And I think the way that you guys finessed this is that for primary contact use, your numbers work, and for protection and anti-degradation protection, your guys' numbers work. So what's the question?
I think it's broader than just bacteria. I mean, I want to know how, if you're developing a site-specific objective, what is the mechanism that you link it to a beneficial use? Where do you call that out?
Well, you call that out in the science that's used to develop.
Okay.
Yeah, you can answer better than I can, sure.
about that. But, I mean, so the whole point of the site-specific criteria is you're saying that that water body can support that designated use with a criterion that is different from what was adopted statewide. You're saying there's something unique about what's happening in that water. So inherently, when you adopt a site-specific criterion or objective, you are saying that this is now the number that will protect the designated use. So it should be, the way you derive the site-specific criterion is by saying this is the number that will protect the designated use. So it should be inherently linked in that analysis.
And if it's not, we'll disapprove
And if it's
it.
not, what do you do?
I'm sorry?
And if it isn't, what do you do? If you have a site-specific criteria or objective which is not linked to a beneficial use, how would you proceed?
I mean, it sounds very case-specific. I'd be curious to see as to whether or not it was an approved objective, and you're just realizing.
So we have a basin plan that's, has all these water quality objectives in them. They're all EPA approved. They've been there a long time. They include, 1,000 site-specific objectives. Very few, maybe a handful, are linked to a beneficial use. And so I think the question stems from, we would like to, have water quality objectives that are attached to beneficial uses. With those that have already been approved, how do we go about doing that in a retroactive way?
Okay. I don't know if, Rebecca, if you wanted to answer this or if you were waiting for me.
Well, I welcome your thoughts. I'll throw in mine, which is that I think that a lot of our basin plans, when they were first compiled in the 70s, there were objectives that were put into place kind of as for the general protection of all of our uses, right? At least that's how I've always interpreted it. And sometimes some of our objectives are specific for the protection of a particular use. For example, our new bacteria ones are specific for the protection of primary contact water recreation. And then for the others, I think you kind of logically apply, and this is probably not the legal answer, but it's how I've kind of thought about it, of, okay, what objective is appropriate for the use in question? And I think then we have opportunities as we go forward to do amendments to our basin plans in order to refine what objective is appropriate for what use. And you guys now have that challenge in front of you with your fecal coliform objective.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with you. I mean, I was actually going to ask you this. When you say linked to the beneficial use, there's two ways of interpreting that. One is that there are states, and it's not just California, that have adopted criterion that just apply blanketly. It doesn't matter what the use is that's assigned to that water. That is the number that they are assigning for that particular parameter for protection of all their uses. And then what those states will do then is that if there is an exception or if they feel like they need more or less stringent criteria, they'll say for any water that's specifically designated this use, then this is the criteria. So it's kind of like a default blanket set, and then they kind of go more specific. I wasn't sure if you meant it that way or if you meant that you currently have water quality objectives that you now aren't certain are actually protective of the uses in question.
We're quite certain that they're more protective than they need to be.
Okay.
But,
so then, I mean, I think the real answer is...
But more the first.
Okay, so I mean, I think if it's the first and you want to revise it to link it to a particular use, I mean, it's just a matter of going through and making that change, figuring it. I mean, the challenge might just be in reformatting how your regs are written to be able to do that. But from a federal reg standpoint, I don't think there's anything particularly special. We just have to be able to know that criteria is actually protective of the use. Doesn't sound like it's, I don't know, Terry, I'm not sure.
No, I think you have it right. I think there's a bigger issue here that is better talked about over a beer at the Punch Bowl tonight at 6. And I know there was one last comment. Do you still want to have that comment, or?
I was just going to add that it is something we are looking at in terms of temperature for site-specific objectives in Region 4 at several of our particular sites. And we're also looking at revising our temperature limits in Region 4. So I don't know. I think we're kind of working through the kinks on that right now, but I think if you have questions, there's representatives of staff here from Region 4, and I can talk to you about it from a 30,000-foot level, since I don't really do science, but I do advise on the law. And we are doing studies to see if that's necessary. And we're especially concerned about climate change. So,
Yeah,
and how
yeah.
that's raising the temperatures of all our waters. And we have species that we think can't survive in waters that are necessarily, have a limit of 80 degrees right now, receiving water limit of 80 degrees. So that's
think
just
that's
an
a great
example.
point.
And we are doing specific studies though
Sweet.
to support that.
Well, thank you for the great questions.